I'd always considered myself a man of the mountains, drawn to the solitude and rugged beauty of the Appalachian Trail. Every year, I'd take a week or two, pack my gear, and disappear into the dense woods of North Carolina. It was my reset, my escape from the clamor of city life. This particular trip, about 5 years back, was meant to be no different. I'd planned a route through a less traveled section, hoping for even greater isolation. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies, perfect for hiking, but as any seasoned outdoorsman knows, the mountains have a mind of their own. My first 3 days were idyllic. Crisp air, the scent of pine and damp earth, the occasional sighting of deer or a curious squirrel. I was making good time, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the forest floor, the only sounds for miles being the wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. I usually camped in a lightweight tent, but on the third evening, I spotted something unusual on my topo map, a small, unmarked cabin icon, deep off the main trail. It was far enough from any official campsites that I figured it was likely a private hunting cabin, or perhaps even abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to deviate from my planned route, hoping to find a rustic shelter for the night, a welcome change from my cramped tent. The trail to the cabin was barely discernible, just a faint deer path winding through increasingly dense undergrowth. As I pushed deeper, the air grew heavy, thick with an almost palpable silence. Even the birds seemed to have quieted. Then, without warning, a thick, rolling fog descended, swallowing the forest whole. It wasn't a gentle mist, it was a wall of white, damp and cold, reducing visibility to a mere few feet. My heart started to beat a little faster. I'd experienced mountain fog before, but never anything this sudden or dense. I pulled out my compass and GPS, confirming I was still headed in the right direction, but the unsettling feeling had already begun to creep in. After what felt like an hour of navigating blind, the faint outline of a structure materialized through the swirling fog. It was indeed a cabin, small and weather-beaten, nestled in a clearing. As I approached, I saw that the windows were dark and the porch sagged with age. It looked utterly deserted. A wave of relief washed over me, a roof over my head for the night, safe from the damp and the creeping cold of the fog. I pushed open the creaky wooden door. Inside, it was surprisingly clean though sparse. A rusty wood stove, a small cot, and a rickety table were the only furnishings. Someone had been here recently. There was a stack of split firewood by the stove. I decided to make myself at home. I lit a small fire in the stove, setting my pack down and beginning to prepare a dehydrated meal. The warmth of the fire, combined with the successful journey, began to soothe my earlier unease. I even managed to chuckle at my own jumpiness. Just a bit of fog, nothing more. As dusk deepened and the fog outside grew even thicker, pressing against the single window like a pale, spectral hand, I heard it. A faint thump from the woods just beyond the cabin. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth. It sounded heavy, like something large had fallen. I dismissed it as a deer, perhaps a branch breaking under the weight of the fog. The cabin was old, it settled and creaked. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of an isolated building. I finished my meal, blew out my small lantern, and settled onto the cot, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. I tried to focus on the warmth of the embers in the stove, the gentle crackle of the wood, but my ears were straining, listening into the oppressive silence. Then came the second sound, distinct and much closer this time. A rhythmic, deliberate scrape drag directly outside the cabin, right near the back wall. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the damp earth, something with a rough surface. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't a branch. This was something moving with purpose. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, straining to hear over its frantic rhythm. The dragging sound continued slowly, deliberately, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. It stopped directly outside the window, then continued. It sounded like it was going in a circle. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. An animal, a bear, perhaps. But a bear wouldn't make that methodical, almost rhythmic dragging noise. It sounded intentional. The dragging stopped at the front door. For a long moment, There was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, internal creaks of the old cabin. Then, a low, guttural thump against the door, as if something incredibly heavy had leaned against it. The old wood groaned. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an animal. There was a faint sniffing sound from just outside the door, then a soft, wet chuff. It sounded large and close. My hand instinctively reached for my small multi-tool, the only thing resembling a weapon I had. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that whatever was outside was not friendly. It was aware I was in here. The sound started again, the scrape drag, moving from the front door, along the side of the cabin towards the back. It paused at the back window again. I imagined eyes, unseen in the fog, peering in, though I knew the window was too grimy and dark for anything to see me inside. But the sheer presence of it, circling my refuge, was suffocating. I lay there for what felt like hours, rigid with terror, listening to the methodical sounds of something large and unknown patrolling the perimeter of the cabin. Every few minutes, there would be another heavy thump against a wall, another low chuff, another prolonged sniff. It was like a monstrous dog, or something far worse, meticulously mapping out its prey. I dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. I fantasized about scrambling out the back window, but the thought of stepping into that thick, silent fog, knowing whatever it was out there, was worse than staying put. I was trapped, just as the first faint hint of pre-dawn gray began to seep through the fog, painting the world in shades of pearl and shadow. The sounds outside abruptly stopped. Utter silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, pregnant with unseen threats. I waited, holding my breath, for another thump, another drag, another sniff. Nothing. Only the slow, steady drip of moisture from the eaves. I lay there for another hour, paralyzed by a mixture of exhaustion and primal fear. Had it left? Or was it just waiting? When the fog finally began to lift, revealing the pale, watery light of morning, I slowly, cautiously crept to the window. The clearing was empty. The forest around the cabin was still, innocent, as if the night's horrors had been nothing but a dream. But as I opened the front door, my eyes immediately fell upon the ground. There, in the damp earth, were deep, irregular gouges, scoring a perfect circle around the entire cabin. Not paw prints, not hoof prints, just long, deep furrows, as if something with incredibly long, sharp claws or protrusions had been dragged around and around, over and over again, in a meticulous patrol. And right in front of the door, clearly pressed into the softened earth, was a single, impossibly large, three-toed print. It was too massive for any animal I knew, too strange, too alien. I didn't wait to see anything else. My pack was already mostly ready. I grabbed it, slammed the door shut, and practically ran back down the barely visible path, not daring to look back, not daring to stop until I was back on the main trail, miles away from that cabin, and that terrifying methodical drag in the fog. I never hiked that section of the Appalachians again, and to this day, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I could almost hear that scrape drag, circling, always circling. I'd always sought out the quiet corners of the world, especially for my photography. My specialty was abandoned places, forgotten landscapes, the kind of beauty found in decay and solitude. This led me to a remote stretch of canyon land in southern Utah, a place so far off the beaten path that it barely registered on most maps. It was a labyrinth of red rock, towering mesas, and narrow slot canyons, a place where you could hike for days without seeing another soul. I'd set up a base camp by an ancient, gnarled juniper tree, planning to spend a week exploring the hidden crevices and dramatic vistas, capturing the stark, silent beauty of it all. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. The air was dry and still, carrying the faint scent of sun-baked rock and desert sage. I'd spend my days scrambling over sandstone, navigating the intricate turns of slot canyons, and setting up my tripod to catch the dramatic play of light and shadow. My nights were spent under a dizzying canopy of stars, a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. I felt utterly alone, completely at peace. I kept a detailed log of my movements, marking my camp and water sources on my topo map, always careful to stay oriented in the vast, confusing landscape. This was a place that demanded respect, and I gave it willingly. On the fourth day, as I was working my way deeper into a particularly winding slot canyon, I noticed something that struck me as slightly out of place. Tucked into a small alcove, hidden almost entirely by a thick cluster of desert brush, was a small, hand-carved wooden doll. It was crude, made from a single piece of dark wood, with simple notches for eyes and a mouth. It lay face down in the dust. My first thought was that a hiker had dropped it, but the remote location and the hidden nature of the alcove made that unlikely. It looked ancient, weathered by years of sun and wind. I picked it up, examined it for a moment, then, feeling a faint chill I couldn't explain, placed it back exactly where I'd found it. It was just a strange curiosity, I told myself, a relic of some past traveler or perhaps even an old Native American offering. The canyons were full of such things. I continued on, pushing the odd find from my mind. That night, as I lay in my tent, the vast silence of the desert seemed to press in on me more acutely than usual. I was just drifting off when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on a breath of wind. It was too soft to make out words, just a breathy, sibilant rustling sound. I sat bolt upright, straining my ears. The air was perfectly still. Not a leaf stirred on the juniper tree outside. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, perhaps some shifting sand, but there was no wind. The sound seemed to come from all around me, an atmospheric hum of soft, dry whispers, rising and falling like an unseen chorus. It lasted for a few minutes, then faded completely, leaving behind an even deeper silence, one that now felt heavy with unspoken things. I told myself I was tired, imagining things in the solitude. The next morning, I woke feeling strangely unrested, the memory of the whispers clinging to me. I decided to explore a new section of the canyon, a series of higher ledges that offered a panoramic view. As I navigated a particularly tricky scramble, I spotted something else. Another wooden doll. This one was perched on a narrow rock shelf, perfectly upright, facing the canyon entrance. It was identical to the first, same crude carvings, same weathered wood. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. The chance of two such unique items being dropped in such a remote area was astronomically low, and this one was placed, not dropped. My gaze swept over the surrounding rock face, but there was no sign of anything else, no footprints in the dust, nothing to suggest another person had been here recently. I left the second doll untouched and continued my hike, trying to convince myself it was just an odd coincidence, a strange regional tradition I knew nothing about. That evening, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to swirl around my tent, a dry, papery rustling that occasionally coalesced into what sounded eerily like individual words, though I could never quite grasp them. They were like secrets being hissed just beyond the edge of hearing, just outside the threshold of understanding. I lay in my sleeping bag, rigid with fear, clutching my hunting knife. The silence of the desert was now a torment, a vast canvas for these insidious, unseen voices. I felt watched, scrutinized by something that existed in the fringes of my perception. I shone my powerful headlamp out into the darkness, sweeping it across the clearing, but saw nothing but the familiar shapes of rocks and brush, distorted by the moving beam. The whispers pulsed, growing louder when the light was away, dimming slightly when I swept it towards the sound. It was playing with me. I spent a sleepless night, huddled in my tent, the whispers a constant, tormenting presence. By morning, my nerves were frayed. I knew I had to get out. As I packed my gear, my hands shaking slightly, I glanced towards my cooking area. There, sitting on my camp stove, was a third wooden doll. This one was different. It had two small, red beads for eyes, and a wide, open mouth carved into a silent scream. It was facing my tent. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over me. This was no coincidence. Someone, or something, was leaving these, and it knew where I was. It had been in my camp while I was sleeping. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed my pack, throwing everything in haphazardly, my only thought to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. I practically ran, scrambling over rocks and through brush, back towards the main dirt track where I'd left my truck. The vast, open canyon now felt like a claustrophobic cage, every shadow a potential hiding place, every gust of wind a sinister whisper. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, that I would turn and see a figure emerge from the red rock, silent and watchful. I pushed myself harder than I ever had, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The image of that screaming doll burned into my mind. I finally reached my truck, fumbling with the keys, my hands trembling so violently I could barely unlock the door. I threw my pack into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The roar of the V8 a comforting, albeit temporary, shield against the silence. As I drove away, kicking up a cloud of red dust, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Nothing, just the endless, empty canyon. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, then a small gas station many miles away. I filled up my tank, my mind still racing, replaying the events of the last 2 days. As I was about to get back in the truck, something caught my eye on the passenger seat. Lying neatly in the center, facing me, was the third wooden doll, the one with the red eyes and the screaming mouth. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. How? I had thrown my pack in the back. I had locked the doors. No, it couldn't be. I looked around wildly, but there was no one else in the desolate gas station parking lot. I picked it up, my fingers recoiling from the cold wood, and threw it as far as I could into the desert brush. I got back in my truck, slammed the door, and drove away, not stopping until I was hundreds of miles from Utah. I never returned to those canyons, and to this day, the memory of those dry, sibilant whispers still haunts my quiet moments, a terrifying reminder that some places are best left unexplored, and some secrets are not meant to be found. For years, I'd held a seasonal job as a fire lookout in a remote national forest in Montana. It was the perfect gig for me, long stretches of solitude, breathtaking views, and a simple, vital duty scan the horizon for smoke. My living quarters were a small cabin at the base of the mountain, a mile or so from the actual fire tower that stood atop the peak. Every morning, I'd hike up to the tower, spend my day observing, logging weather, and enjoying the quiet, then descend back to my cabin for the night. It was a predictable, peaceful existence, a balm for a soul weary of the rat race. My particular tower was one of the oldest in the region, a rickety wooden structure that swayed faintly in strong winds. It offered a 360-degree panorama of rolling pine forests, distant peaks, and vast, empty valleys. Cell service was non-existent, and the nearest town was a 2-hour drive away. My only regular contact was a weekly resupply drop by a ranger who would leave provisions at the base of the mountain trail. This meant weeks could pass without seeing another human face, and that suited me just fine. I had my books, my shortwave radio, and the endless, silent companionship of the wilderness. About halfway through my second summer, a small detail began to bother me. Each morning, as I'd arrive at the tower, I'd notice the latch on the heavy trapdoor that sealed off the cabin at the top of the tower would be slightly ajar. Not open, not even unlatched, just loosened. It was a simple, old-fashioned bolt latch, and it had a habit of sticking, so I always made sure to secure it firmly the night before. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the tower settling in the wind, or perhaps just my own forgetfulness. But it happened consistently, day after day, for about a week. Every morning, that latch, just a hair's breadth from being fully secured. It was too regular to be coincidence. A faint prickle of unease started to form in the back of my mind. Then, one particularly clear afternoon, as I was sweeping the horizon with my binoculars, I caught a glimpse of something unusual. Far below, at the edge of the forest, where it met a particularly dense patch of old growth, was a faint flicker of light. It was brief, almost like a reflection, but it stood out against the uniform green. I focused my binoculars, but the light was gone. I spent the next hour meticulously scanning that area, but saw nothing. It was probably just the sun reflecting off a wet rock, I reasoned. My imagination was probably working overtime in the solitude. I logged it, noting possible reflection, unable to confirm, but a seed of suspicion had been planted. The next day, As I descended the tower stairs in the late afternoon, heading back to my cabin, I noticed something else. A small, smooth river stone, unlike any of the jagged rocks that made up the path, was placed directly in the center of the lowest stair. It was clearly intentional. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers. It was warm from the sun. I looked around, feeling a sudden chill despite the heat of the afternoon. There were no tracks, no disturbed pine needles on the path. I tossed the stone into the undergrowth and continued my descent, quickening my pace. The feeling of unease was growing into something more concrete, more sinister. I knew with a creeping certainty that I wasn't alone out here. The pattern of the loosened latch continued every single morning. And then, new things started. One evening, I returned to my cabin to find the small wooden stool I used to chop kindling had been moved from its usual spot by the woodpile to directly in front of my cabin door, facing it as if someone had just finished sitting there watching my entrance. Another morning, I found a small pile of freshly picked huckleberries on the railing of the tower's observation deck, meticulously arranged in a small circle. They weren't there when I'd left the previous evening. It was all so subtle, so non-threatening on the surface, but it was designed to let me know I was being watched. My peace was eroding, replaced by a constant, gnawing paranoia. I started carrying my hunting knife everywhere, even inside my cabin. Then came the night the real terror began. I was in my cabin, reading by the dim light of my lantern, when I heard a faint tapping at my window. It was soft, hesitant, like a twig brushing against the glass. I froze, my blood turning to ice. My cabin was built on a slight rise. The window was easily 6 feet off the ground. Whatever was tapping would need to be standing on something. I slowly, silently, reached for my flashlight. The tapping stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears. Then, a distinct scraping sound, directly against the outer wall of my cabin, just below the window. It sounded like fingernails dragging across the rough wood. It moved, slowly, deliberately, around the perimeter of my small home, a sickening, grating sound that vibrated through the floorboards. I gripped my knife, my knuckles white. This wasn't an animal. This was too methodical, too deliberate. The scraping stopped directly at my front door. I heard a faint sigh, then a very soft, wet sniff from just outside. My entire body was rigid with terror. I imagined a face pressed against the crack under the door, a pair of eyes peering in. I slowly, carefully, moved to the corner of the cabin, away from the door, my heart pounding in my ears like a war drum. I stayed there, paralyzed by fear, for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence outside. Every shadow a monstrous shape, every creak of the cabin a potential invasion. Just as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the scraping sound returned, moving away from my door, back around the cabin, and then fading into the distance. I waited, not daring to move, until the sun was fully up and the forest was bathed in its comforting light. When I finally crept to the door and peered out, there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed ground. The forest looked utterly normal, serene. But as I walked to the base of the fire tower that morning, preparing for my shift, my eyes fell on the small, smooth river stone I'd tossed into the undergrowth days earlier. It was back, placed perfectly in the center of the lowest stair, just like before. I didn't bother going up the tower that day. I knew. Whatever it was watching me, playing with me, and it had been in my cabin. It was waiting for me. I packed my most essential gear into my truck, leaving everything else behind. I drove away, not looking back, my mind racing with images of the loosened latch, the distant flicker of light, the placed stones, the whispers, the tapping, the scratching. I never returned to that fire tower, never went back to that job. And sometimes even now, when I'm alone and the wind is howling outside, I swear I can hear a faint, methodical scraping against the wall, a sound that reminds me that deep in those vast, silent forests, there are things that watch, things that wait, and things that know exactly where you are. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into the deep woods. The wilderness holds many secrets, and some are best left undisturbed. If these stories made your skin crawl, please give this video a like, and consider subscribing to the channel for more true horror tales. And if you have your own inexplicable encounters from the remote corners of the world, share them in the comments below. Stay safe out there.